before we dive in, I'm Jim Pugh. I'm one of the founders of the Universal Income Project, along with Sandia here. So we're an organization that is focusing on basic income in the United States. We've been convening various conversations on the topic over the past few months. I know there are a number of folks here who have been some of those. Really trying to broaden and deepen the conversation around basic income and what it might look like in the United States. We're also in the process of starting to dive into some national program efforts. Hopefully get to community talking about this, not just here in the Bay Area, but around the country. But for tonight, I'm super excited to have Jody here from GiveDirectly and to have all of you here. So I'm going to turn it over to Sonia.
Okay, so as Joe said, this is Joe. So we're going to talk tonight, but first, I want to say a couple thank yous to Kobo for hosting us in this space. Very co-working space on the way over here. If you have questions, you can direct them to Alex over there after the event. And okay, so Joe, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So Joe is with GiveDirectly. He's the regional director for special projects. So GiveDirectly has been doing research since 2011, right, on unconditional cash transfers, figuring out whether studying the effects and seeing whether they can aid in solving extreme poverty conditions in Kenya and Uganda, right? And so you guys have been studying just giving cash to people as opposed to these traditional charitable models, like providing goods and services, things like trying to increase literacy rate or providing food assistance. So why did you want to study cash?
Yeah, so I think this is on.
You have to get really closer.
Look. 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 Let me over again. Hello, hello.
I think so.
Sure, we can do that. Yeah, so GiveDirectly was started because of two basically converging trends. The first.
Yeah, let's just talk.
Yeah, so two basic converging trends. The first one is the sort of advancement of very good mobile payments technology. And so I was telling Jim earlier that in both Kenya and Uganda, we're able to do about like $1 million per month per laptop in terms of cash transfers sent straight to people's mobile phones. And so there's a sort of advancement of that technology. And then second, a wave of evidence showing that cash transfers work. That sort of all over the world, people don't misspend the money they receive. They don't sort of spend on tobacco or alcohol or gambling or things like that. By and large, they don't stop working either. And then instead, you see sort of broad-based positive results. That people increases in consumption or food security, increases in assets, things like that. And so it's those two things coming together, and then the sort of realization that there's no NGO exclusively devoted to delivering cash transfers. And so that's basically how GiveDirectly got started.
Fantastic. You guys just announced that you're going to be doing this $30 million 10-year study on universal basic income. And I'm sure most of you are familiar, but the concept of universal basic income, the idea that you can create a program that offers all people in a country, enough money to cover their basic needs. So you could get a stipend, let's say, every month to make sure that you have enough money to pay for food and for health. So for the main group that you're studying, you are providing at least 6,000 Kenyans with enough money to live on regardless of whether they're working or not. And then you mentioned that you have a couple of other different groups, 20,000 people that you're studying different incentives with. So what motivated you all to run this 10-year study?
Yeah, and so I think in general, GiveDirectly, a big way that we view that we can have impact is by studying different types of cash transfers. And so the first thing we did when we were founded was we did a randomized controlled trial. We tested a bunch of different things about cash transfers, lump sums versus streams of cash, bigger versus smaller transfers, giving to men versus women, a sort of whole set of different things to try to produce evidence. And the reason why we think that's valuable is there's a lot of policy debate that informs. People both considering cash versus other things that you can sort of provide a benchmark of all these things you're buying to give to people. If you just gave them that in cash, this is what would happen. As well as people with different types of cash programs, whether those are means-tested ones or not, targeted towards specific groups like the elderly or not, And so there's sort of a big range of policy that we like to influence. And so with basic income, we saw this sort of debate growing again in the media and policy and things like that. And an opportunity for us to sort of contribute to that debate by doing different types of experimentation about how basic income works.
So you've looked at a variety of different outcomes in the past, but what are you going to be looking at with this study?
Yeah, and so I think something that's important with cash is to look at a broad set of metrics. People are very different, so they spend money they receive very differently. And so there's a few different categories of metrics we'll look at. The first one is the sort of basic economic welfare. And so for that, you look at things like consumption, how much are people really spending every day. With the result you'd expect is if you give people more money, they spend more money on things that they want. You also look at things like assets in terms of what is the composition of their purchases. Is it mostly just they buy more food, or are they investing in more land or livestock or things to improve their business? You also look at things like food security or things like that in terms of those sort of basic welfare measures. I think some of the other measures that are important for the basic income debate are a fewfold. One of them is time use. And so a lot of the way this gets boiled down in the media is do people work or not? And so I think that question is important. How much are people working and what type of work are they doing? There's also how are people spending the rest of their time? Are they spending more time in caretaking or investing in education or things like that? I think another sort of set of outcomes that's really important, especially for a long-term study. And so the people receiving our sort of pure basic income will receive up to 12 years. I think for that sort of long-term study, a big question is how does it change risk-taking or investment behavior? And so there's a sort of whole host of investments you might consider making if you had a safety net. And so in San Francisco, maybe that's sort of taking some time to learn to code or something like that. In Kenya, it might look like sort of migrating to Nairobi for a different type of job, or investing in a crop that takes a long time to mature, or similarly learning a new skill or investing in education, or investing in education for your children, so putting them from primary to secondary schools. And so there's a whole host of different types of investments of time and money, and different sort of levels of risk that we want to evaluate. And I think sort of two other categories. One, there's sort of the sort of social dynamics, with I think gender being a big piece of that. A big question is how does society feel if everyone around you is receiving a basic income, if everyone sort of has this basic safety net? One aspect that we found with our first RCT is a big impact on gender relations and sort of separately stress. And so on gender relations, we found in general increases in female empowerment for recipients of cash, with a subset of that being large decreases in domestic violence. With sort of stress in general, we found marked reductions in stress levels. And so that's measured a lot of different ways. There's questions like how stressed are you feeling? In our first RCT, we also literally measured people's cortisol levels. You can sort of use a cheese law to see what level of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And so you saw big reductions in that. And so I think a big question with basic income is when you provide this safety net, different types of cash, different types of forms, how does that make people feel? How does it make society feel? And so that's sort of a whole category of questions that I think we'll get at in different ways. And I think the last category is basically how people view their lives. And so a question in the sort of basic income debate is, will people stop working and then will people be less happy? You know, like they don't need to work, so they stop, and because they don't have work, they're less happy. I think the sort of broader category of question of that is how do people's dreams change? How do people's sort of long-term plans or aspirations change when they have this long-term safety net? And so that's something we'll sort of be doing research on as well, trying to extract that out in different types of questions to get a sense of how do people's own sort of life views change when you have that kind of longer-term safety net.
As you mentioned, the basic income debate has been really heating up in the U.S. at the moment, but we've had conversations about basic income before. So, you know, there have been other studies done in the past on similar programs like cash transfer programs. In the United States, in the 1970s, there are actually 4 states that experimented with cash transfer programs. How is the study that you're doing different from them and from other cash transfer programs generally?
Yeah, and so I think there's a sort of obvious advantage of testing basic income in the developing world, is that it's a lot cheaper. So $30 million in absolute terms is not cheap. In general, this is like a really ambitious project. But the sort of comparable project in the US would cost sort of close to $1 billion or something like that. And so I think because it's cheaper, we get to do a few things that I think sort of distinguish the study and will allow us to contribute to the debate. One of those is universality. And so the sort of policy question that's usually phrased is a universal basic income. So that would mean everyone is receiving. Typically, the way that's tested is through individuals sort of individually receiving. And So at the NIT experiments in the 1970s, it was sort of people randomly selected into different areas to sort of receive this negative income tax while their neighbors were. With our study, whole villages will receive the basic income, and so basically it'll meet the bar. Basically everyone you know is receiving a basic income, which I think sort of changes some of the social dynamics. That's both a lot more expensive because you have to sort of provide the cash to whole communities and compare those communities to other ones. So I think it's pretty important for trying to understand how would this policy actually look. I think the other sort of big difference with the NIT experiments is this one will be considerably longer term. And so it varies experiment to experiment, but by and large those are shorter term programs. Well, this one will provide cash up to 12 years. I think both of those two things give us sort of core questions of the basic income policy that we'll be able to test with our
Can you talk a little bit more about, so as you said, most of these randomized control trials have been on individuals. And one thing that I find really compelling about your study is that you're doing that in community. Can you talk a little bit more about those differences and what things you might be able to see that the whole community is getting after this?
Yeah, I think it's two things. That one, sort of there are spillover effects of the cash. That if your neighbor is getting cash, they might pay you. Maybe you're the person who sort of cuts wood or builds walls or things like that. And if they have a little bit more cash, they give you money, which then sort of flows to that local economy more. And so there's this sort of spillover question or kind of macro effect question that I think is pretty important for understanding how a universal policy can differ from randomly giving cash individuals. I think the second one is this sort of social fabric question, which is both like, how did my incentives in terms of how I spend my time and spend my money change if everyone's receiving versus I'm just receiving? And also, how society feels change if everyone's receiving? If everyone has the safety net, do they start pooling things like caretaking that they weren't doing before? Do they think about work differently? I think that's sort of like, is society different if all society is receiving? It's at least a sort of important question about trying to think about basic income. So I think those are sort of two things I'm excited about to see universal.
Yeah, absolutely. So what were the biggest challenges to designing a study like this?
Yeah, I think it's a lot. It's a sort of funny combination of very different problems. And so the sort of obvious one is that we're like crowdfunding one of the larger social policy experiments, and that's very difficult. And so that's sort of happening in the backdrop while we're coordinating a few different things. One piece is trying to design research that will sort of inform the global debate and sort of answer the important questions, which is itself pretty difficult. I think another piece is trying to sort of communicate the research. Something that was interesting about the 1970s experiment was how communication mistakes or like small study mistakes got blown up. And so a sort of funny thing was that there was an initial result that divorces went up in the NIT experiments that sort of later discredited. And just sort of seeing that initial result basically killed or contributed to killing the policy and the pilot experimentation in the 1970s. And so there's a pretty hard communication thing, which GiveDirectly has at a number of different levels, talking to different types of donors, talking to different types of policymakers to try to sort of explain why this policy is important. And I think there's also this sort of layer of a ton of operational challenges that we'll have, over 100 people on the ground, enrolling people door to door in communities, the full-time call center in answering people's questions and things like that. And so those types of problems are different ones, but they're sort of the same types of problems with having a large customer service department or something like that. So it's a sort of funny combination of that with communications, with research, with a sort of like very hard crowdfunding type of work.
So, what implications do you think this has for basic income in the United States?
Yeah, it's interesting. The sort of obvious thing is that there's big differences between Canada and the United States. So we have to be mindful in terms of how we approach the research to try to produce research that's globally valuable. And so we've done that in a few ways. And in part, Alan Kruger, who is the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the U.S., is sort of helping us design the research to make it globally sort of politically relevant. And so it goes down to like the sort of survey type questions you're answering, the sort of pieces that you're focusing on, what seems most generalizable. And I think some of the questions are, some of them are, if you have a sort of safety net, do you stop working? How does sort of your life view change? How does your risk taking change? It feels like some of those questions are potentially universal. And also to the extent that they're not, if the Y Combinator study finds something vastly different, that helps isolate something interesting about the US or about Kenya that's operating differently. If people work less in the US but not anywhere else in the developing world, is that a lack of opportunities or something like that? So I think even to the extent where there are sort of context differences that dominate the research, I think that sort of isolation effect is still pretty important for, okay, so it's actually, this is what's dominating and how basic income is affecting people in the US.
So you talked a little bit earlier about trying to communicate the results of the work that you've done, and the, some of the things, challenges that scientists have in the negative income tax experience in the United States. So can you talk a little bit about your plan to communicate results? And since this is such a long study, I mean, are you waiting to the end to sort of release information about what happened, or communicating things in the meantime along the way?
Right. So I think the first time we'll get sort of real rigorous results is 2 years after the payments start. And at that point, you'll start to be able to see how people are reacting in the short term to having a long-term savings. So if you have 12 years of payments, how does that sort of inform your decision making now? That same sort of risk-taking kind of pieces, even how much people are working and things like that. And so we plan to sort of have a sort of series of regular follow-up surveys starting in 2 years and sort of continuing every sort of 2 to 5 years after to make sure that both results are getting out early to inform a debate that's happening now, and we're sort of getting the kind of full arc of what the impact is of receiving basically.
Are you doing studies more often surveys more often than every 2 years? Or are these the public ones, or is that actually your time point?
That'll be the time point for the research survey. So the way GiveDirectly typically works is there's a totally independent organization doing the research survey, and they're talking about receiving households and control households that aren't receiving, and tracking both over time to try to get a sense of what are the impacts and how can they compare them to people not receiving, people receiving some other type of cash. And so that's sort of the time frame for the research survey. GiveDirectly itself looks like a company that cares a lot about sort of customer service. And so we do a lot of surveying. Did you receive your money? Did you experience any problems? Did anyone in your community or GiveDirectly ask you for a bribe? Is anyone fighting or complaining? Things like that. And we also have people calling us. And so our interactions will be front-loaded relative to that 2 years time frame. And typically,
and then you mentioned earlier that you both have one group of people that's receiving full basic income for 12 years, but then a couple of other different groups that you will be testing against. Can you talk a little bit more about what those other groups look like?
Yeah, so it's a few pieces. The first thing is having a control group of people who aren't receiving it. And so a pretty important piece of doing social science research is making sure we know what would have happened without the cash. And so we'll be tracking a group of people who aren't receiving the basic income and tracking them over 12 years as well, to try to get a sense of how that's evolving. Then there's 2 other likely groups that we're having to sort of isolate different aspects of the basic income. The first one is a group of people receiving cash for 2 years. And the reason why that's important is it's the same amount of cash, also distributed universally, but you can compare the group receiving 2 years to the group receiving 12 years to see how does specifically the long-term element change things. And I think this is pretty exciting because it speaks to some of the other studies in the basic income literature. There's other studies that have done it for shorter term periods and seen different types of results. And this is getting a sense of how should we extrapolate those going forward. And so that sort of group specifically isolates what is that sort of long-term component that people say, okay, that's that long time. The other compared group is people receiving lump sums. And so this is the debate we've seen some in the basic income community as well. If we want to distribute cash universally, one approach is regular streams of a small amount of cash. In the US, maybe it's $1,000. Another approach is large grants. So people have proposed things like child grants. So if you receive $20K when you have a child, or you can imagine a one-time large grant or something like that. And so we'll be tracking a group of people who receive basically the same amount as they were receiving cash for 2 years, which turns out to be about like $500 per year per person. So we'll be tracking that group relative to the sort of stream group to see what are the differences and impacts there. And I think the goal here is to say one is better, but to sort of map different types of outcomes or goals against different types of path approaches. And so one thing we found in the first study we did is if you give people lumpier amounts of money, so fewer chunks, and more of it, people will buy more assets. If you give people regular streams over longer periods of time, you get better improvements in things like food security, which is fairly intuitive. That if you keep having that safety net, you definitely have sort of, you can buy food every month or whatever it is. But if you get it all at once, you don't have to worry about saving it. You can sort of big investment plan. And so I think fleshing out that sort of menu of different types of outcomes that policymakers might care about, and then different types of cash approaches is what we're doing with that.
So now I'm going to turn, we got a couple of questions on the event page on Facebook that people wanted to ask. So the first one, I'd like to know about the impact of basic income on youth unemployment and crime. I've read there's a direct relationship between the two, but I don't know if crime is mostly due to boredom or economic vulnerability.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is the interesting thing about the cash research that's been done so far. And so one thing is that everyone in this group should lead with is that the cash research on developing world cash transfer programs is both sort of deep and wide. There's a ton of papers done all over the world, and that sort of evidence is pretty consistent. One interesting feature of that evidence is it's typically targeted towards sort of specific groups of people in society. In the same way that sort of U.S. welfare typically targets single-headed families. In the developing world, the sort of cash transfer programs are typically somewhat similar, that they're sort of targeted towards vulnerable groups like people, families who belong to orphans or the elderly or something like that. And so I think this research will target a demographic that's undersurveyed and understudied. One cool thing is there is some research about different types of youth and the impact of cash. So there's a cash transfer study in Liberia that specifically gave cash transfers to men who were criminals. And sort of pair that both with and without basically sort of reintegration training, taking them to beds and sending them to be here. But the cash basically enhanced that reintegration training. And for sort of both people receiving cash and people receiving the training, and especially people receiving both, sort of raised their criminality from. And so that's sort of one interesting paper that might lead you to believe you can expect something similar. Another sort of different type of youth group that has received cash and received interesting results, which I think is at the risk-taking piece, is there's a study in Malawi that tracked giving cash transfers to families with young women, and giving cash transfers also specifically to young women. These are girls who are sort of at the end of high school years. And the funny thing about that, which I think gets the different types of risk-taking or investments you can make, is they systematically got married later, pregnant later, and had lower rates of sort of STDs, which is a different type of, if you can provide that safety net, how does that change investment risk-taking behavior, sort of playing out in a sort of very different group. And so I think we should be able to see these types of results with different types of demographics and saying, okay, for this type of group in this type of circumstance, with these trade-offs, how is that sort of cash support?
Are you tracking community crime statistics?
Yeah, it's something I sort of mentioned the Liberia paper because it's a sort of more current context. I think we'll try to do so, and I think we'll see. It's one of those things that we don't know a whole lot about sort of rural Kenyan crime, so I think that's something we'll sort of try to wait and see. Is that an interesting result?
I'm interested in the impact on relationships. You talked a little bit about this when you guys first studied giving cash to male versus female households. Marital and familial tensions often decrease money. Are separations and divorce decrease within the group?
Yeah, interesting. I guess that, yeah, so the results from our first study was that giving cash probably could make people less stressed in general, sort of reduce tension. And so we saw improvements in female empowerment, both sort of via domestic violence and through sort of broader things that you asked surveys about. And so that's something I'm sort of really curious to see validated or confirmed in the
Can you talk a little bit what kind of questions were you asking in terms of female empowerment?
Right, I think it's things like, there's a sort of variety in terms of this person was emotionally abusive or yelled at me and things like that. I feel involved in decision making. There's just sort of like a whole host that you ask, and a lot of them are sort of like the 1 to 10 type questions, and people try to sort of get a sense of this is a capturing the concept, and then sort of and so I think that's a piece of it. I think another piece of it that I'm curious about is, and I think we'll see is, we will be providing cash directly to individuals. And so GiveDirectly's typical program is a household grant. And so one person will hold the phone, but we try to communicate that this cash is for your household. You can find your spouse and things like that. Yeah, so we send global money. Kenya has basically one of the deepest global money networks in the world. It's like Venmo, but there are cash out agents everywhere, even in sort of rural places, outside of the village or something like that. And so when I said we sent about $1 million per laptop, that's happening in Kenya and Uganda. We click a button on the laptop, and people are receiving text saying I've received $500. And so typically in our program, it's a household program. Here, every individual sort of adult in a family will receive a phone and will receive grants specifically to them. So I think an important question, both in Kenya and the US, is how does that sort of specifically having individuals that can change things where a relationship might be more coercive and things like that. But are there separations that are sort of socially beneficial because it's a bad relationship, because it's a coercive relationship? So I think that's something specific to the individual UBI that we want to have.
So I want to open it up now to audience questions.
So I just want to make sure that I understand more questions. Is this the first full village, or is this not the first full village study?
So repeat. So is this the first full village study that's been done?
No. And so the studies that have done, quote, saturation sites before is there was one city called Dupton in Manitoba. There was one village in Namibia, and then there was something like a 12-village pilot in Namibia. I think the thing that's unique is this is both one a lot more villages, and it's sort of combining that universal picture with a much longer cash transfer. So those are particularly shorter.
How many villages are you guys?
Right. So the pure UBI group of people will be 30 to 50 villages, and then we'll have something like 100 to 200 of the sort of comparison villages that isolate this different effects.
And did you see, is there data on inflation or immigration that has like inflation makes it right irrelevant, or immigration complicates the.
So will you be looking at inflation, immigration indicators, and can you do this kind of study?
Yeah, and so we'll track some of the macro effects, and we actually have a study now that's doing this with our other cash transfer program. So they're doing this their first round of follow-up survey now, and that study basically forced different concentrations of GiveDirectly's one-time transfer at different times, so you could track kind of local market effects. And so it was doing exactly the thing we want of surveying specific shopkeepers all over CIA County in Kenya and tracking how are the prices sort of changing in response to the cash transfer. And so we'll have results on that this year, and we'll sort of pairing that with the UBI study as well. For immigration, I haven't seen a whole lot in sort of previous literature. Namibia had some people in migrate, I think. For us, we'll be tracking it, and if you migrate out of the village, we'll continue to pay you, so you're not paid to stay within the village. And there won't be a reward for migrating into the village. It'll sort of be a one-time eligibility.
How do you isolate the effect of people moving into the village receiving payment in order to start a business, capitalize on people with much more money?
Which aspect?
Like, it may look like the villages receiving this income are more prosperous because more people are on there to start businesses. And that would only be, you only see that effect relative to the towns not receiving this. So if you find it in the country, you couldn't guarantee that effect would happen again. How are you going to control that?
Right. So I think one piece of it is that the research group will be studying specific people over time. And so we won't be sort of going back to the village and seeing what's changed. It'll sort of be saying, I saw Frederick 2 years ago, and I'm going to find him, and I'm going to work really, really hard to do so. And so I'll find him in Uganda or Nairobi or London. So that itself is a pretty hard thing to do, but it'll be tracking specific individuals over time. This is sort of, will those individuals benefit from other people moving in? Is a tricky question. I think you can sort of count number of shops and try to get a sense of who's starting this. It's a tricky question.
What's in the government's response, and how will you be able to navigate the market?
Right. And so in general, we sort of have worked with the government for a while. We've been in Kenya for a little over 5 years now. And so they're aware of us, and we're kind of having regular conversations of what are your questions? And so their questions, they're not sort of particularly interested in, I'm considering the fullest version of UBI now. But they do have sort of questions that, because we're smaller, more flexible, have different constituents, are prepared to test. And so, like, I think I was in Nairobi about a month ago, and we were talking to them about the demographic thing, that most of their programs are targeted towards orphans because those groups are sort of politically favorable, people have a lot of sympathy for those groups. And so this is an opportunity to spell out the set of outcomes for a different type of demographic of people who are just poor, but are otherwise able and young and things like that. And so that's what the conversation has been like. The rest was sort of trying to coordinate with avoiding sort of access overlap with their existing programs.
How are you incentivizing people in the villages that are not receiving money to spaces?
Yeah, and that's tricky. And so
So the question is for control groups, people that aren't receiving money, how do you make sure that you can actually continue to survey them and reach out to them?
yeah, and so control households totally consent to participate. And the sort of standard is to provide some sort of small gift to reward them for participating. In this case, because we want to track them for an ultra long period of time, we'll be giving all sort of surveyed control households itself. And so that's not a sort of big thing in terms of the overall impact comparison. It'll be like the $20 note for your cell phone stake on it. But it is both a small gift and will facilitate sort of keeping up with people over time.
Actually, I think it will be great, so I don't know if you're really going about this point. I was thinking if it can be useful to create a structure around these people that we can find, like to support these people in the sense, or maybe someone that proposes some work to these people in exchange for the land or work of public utility. And also maybe some people that the people that receive the money can have access also to services like to these people like psychologists. So we can see that maybe a period of time in which these people can work on themselves and then they insert back in the society. I don't know if that's whether time is
Yeah, so I think what you're asking is whether you can, in addition to providing people with money, also provide them with support, for example, psychological support or opportunities to find work.
Not completely thinking about the money also exchanges are work of public utility. Because maybe these people are doing if you oblige them, that must be to go to some courses to work on themselves. Imagine if people are in field maybe can also be originally in some difficult life circumstances. So they have not just give the money, but just to provide the help and the psychologist or free courses in all the kind of things that they can go to be more strong in a sense. And so it's part of the structure that support them, like psychologists and also other kinds of special tools, yoga courses or qualifications courses for
Yeah. And so we sort of debate things like this all the time. And in general, like our organizational bias is sort of a stubborn level of focus. So we focus a pretty extreme amount on just getting the cash there, making sure they receive it okay, and dealing with like customer service types issues related to they definitely received the delivery. But this sort of are there light touch ways of connecting people who just received this cash to good ways to spend it, or good advice is a constant debate we're having. Sort of UBI specific debate we were having this morning actually was what type of low touch information provision would help? Is it a list of these are the 10 best skills trainers in the area, or this is how some people have spent money they received and they got these returns from their investments? And so I think it's possible we do some type of very lightweight information provision, but I'm not exactly sure what sort of direction that will take. And if we do, it'll be that versus not receiving the information. So the big question is, the temptation is always to sort of layer on more and more advice, so that has a pretty clear cost, that it takes more time, the sort of person is literally in the household's house for longer and things like that, and so, and the advice might not be good. And so it'll be sort of that head-to-head comparison to the extent we provide information or sort of point people towards services or the bus to the Nairobi or whatever it is.
Are there obvious things, like big, sort of questions that you get all the time that you think would be most obvious to answer, or services to provide?
Right. I personally would think GiveDirectly even further on this stubborn side. And so the thing I say is it's really hard to out-farm a subsistence farmer. Turns out they're pretty good at it, and they know a lot of other ones who do it. That said, there are lots of information provision sort of interventions, and I'm sure some are good. But I think it is a hard problem, and it's hard to farm. It's hard to sort of pick the right business to start, and the people most equipped are the recipients, and not me. So yeah, I think there's promise, and I think it's a pretty hard question.
In the back.
So it sounds as though a lot of this program is based on identifying people and connecting people via phones. How do you aim to prevent fraud and issues where people can steal from any of the individuals that are actually missing them and become a member of this?
So since you're providing money through phones, how do you make sure that you're avoiding the fraud or risk of having your phone stolen?
Yeah. And so the run-up to starting to receive cash from GiveDirectly involves 3 to 4 distinct interactions with the GiveDirectly employee. And so that process is someone keeps visiting the house that they were told Frederick lives in and looks for Frederick. In between those steps, we're sort of overlaying a set of data checks. And so that's been everything from comparing GPS points recorded at the households at each sort of step of the conversation and saying, is it the same place? For a while, we uploaded pictures taken of the recipient to mechanical turf and confirmed that that was the same person throughout. And so there's a lot of sort of steps along the enrollment process. And I think once we start payments, the right answer is the follow-up process. And so every time we're paying, every time we send a payment, we sort of call the person and sort of confirm the identity of the person and ask them questions that are sort of more operational. I think given the sort of ultra long term, whether we want to sort of overlay a periodic in-person visit again is a good question.
Okay, right here. Yes.
Okay, so are you testing this based on also socioeconomic level, like if they're wealthy versus less well off? Because I'm interested in seeing if that would even make a difference in a wealthy person's life versus not so wealthy. And also follow up to that would be how do you expect the country to make up the money that you give? Is it purely through economic growth for the whole country, or like more efficient outputs, like labor output?
Right. So the first one is in the areas we're working, they're typically very, very poor areas. So the vast majority of people living under $1 or $2 a day. That said, there is some variation, so we will have some sort of wealth or income variation to say wealthier people who maybe needed a safety net less use it in this way. But I think that's a pretty important question. The second question is how will people sort of make up the money given?
Like if the government gave, if the whole government, say they were going to do this for a century, or if they adopted this program for as actual policy, how do they expect to make that money back? Like it's not sort of free money, or there's some sort of anticipated return on investment, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I think the question is similar to like what gets debated in the U.S. There is like, is there a spillover? You give these people money and they're able to invest more, they're able to invest in themselves more. There is that sort of question. There's a similar question that happens in the U.S. of how can you repurpose existing social protection spending. So that's typically much lower. It has a lot of the same problems in terms of both being sort of segmented out into being a lot of different programs with their own specific program officers and things like that, with their own sort of success at targeting people they want to receive the money. And so there's that sort of repurposing question. And then I think the sort of answer, a funding answer that's maybe unique to the developing countries is that aid is an option. So in general, institutional funders like USAID or the World Bank do support some social protection in the developing world. And I think a sort of neat thing about basic income is it reminds people that the cost required to bring everyone out of extreme poverty isn't all that much. Brookings added up the gap of how much everyone earns relative to the sort of extreme poverty line of $1.25 or $1.90 per day. And that was something like $80 billion per year, which is less than first official development assistance. And so all sort of global aid flows are more than what would be required to lift everyone up to that sort of very sort of minimum line. It's also less than what a UBI would cost just in the U.S. And so I think those comparisons, they're not sort of a specific policy proposal. You couldn't not do a UBI in the U.S. and do that. But it gives you a sense that the
the sort of cash transfers required to sort of lift people above a very basic level of sustenance isn't all that much relative to all the money out there and already getting spent on it.
So it's right now, sorry, it's purely aid-based, like that. You think after this 10-year study, the country itself could run this program for years to come?
Right, and so those are the sort of levers they have. GiveDirectly program is aid-based. It's based off of donors, people in the U.S. and elsewhere who are giving and we're redistributing it. I think Kenya in particular, they don't currently spend enough on social protection to adopt the sort of full UBI. But just like in the U.S., they have the sort of same possible questions of how to adapt a UBI-like template. And so whether that's a sort of geographically scoped targeting, bring everyone in the sort of north who are extraordinarily poor in Kenya up to a certain level of sustenance. Demographic targeting a sort of specific or a universal pension. Or there have been proposals in India of a sort of UBI with a sort of much lower benefit level. And so I think you sort of start with that template, show these results, and then you have a number of different levers that you say, this is how we can apply it in this particular case.
So a lot of our questions come down to, are you measuring this, are you measuring that? Could you just like get out ahead of that and give us a more holistic idea of the kinds of data that you're collecting and really the level of granularity of each of those kinds through the 30 years?
Yeah, so I think I started talking about it a little bit with the outcomes. And so the way that looks is people visiting every 2 years, finding a sort of specific person they talked to before, and then asking them about pretty high levels of detail about different types of things. So that is like asking them to count up all of their spending in the last month, or valuing all of their assets, or the sort of food security type questions, or things like, did you go hungry in the last week? How many meals in the last week included fish or beef, or things like that. The sort of researcher who are working who has a lot of experience in Kenya and developing economics has found that timely surveys are best done over the phone. And so that would look like sort of several rounds of calling people and saying, what did you do yesterday? And you sort of add up and sort of average across all those times you ask people what they did yesterday to get a sense of this is how they're splitting their day between work and leisure and caretaking and things like that. The things like investment and risk taking, I think you sort of ask about specific behaviors in terms of trying to get a sense of how employment or sort of business owning or migration have changed and things like that. And you also ask about a set of attitudes. And that those look like a sort of series of survey questions that are like, how do you feel about, do you feel like you can do something to make yourself richer, or what have you done in the last year to try to improve your life the next way? You sort of ask a bunch of questions to try to get at that concept. And I think the sort of community questions you try to ask are things geared towards how is a community feeling. So GiveDirectly operationally asks a lot, have there been complaints in the community? I think here you want to sort of ask, are people fighting more or less? Are people arguing more or less? And I think that's sort of both true at the community level and at the sort of individual relationship level. How are decisions made in your family? Multiple choice, things like that. And so you ask, these are typically like 3-hour interactions with someone. You're asking all of these questions every couple of years and tracking what is going to be thousands of people over time and sort of trying to add up that picture.
I'm not going to ask you to predict what you think is going to happen, but what would be the most awesome results for you for GiveDirectly? Like, what, all these different variables, what would be like, right, this is the outcome that means that we're doing exactly the right thing, exactly what to do, and everybody's here to like, right, versus the other hand, like, well, it's a good idea, but like all this other things.
Right. And so I think in some ways the deck is stacked for cash. And so I'm not expecting to find with this sort of like 199 study that people print this time or something like that. But like a lot of the sort of general questions about cash transfer, do people spend the money to improve their lives? That's mostly known. I think the question that is specific to UBI are the sort of unique aspects. So that's where I'm like, is there something cool here? With one of those being the long-term study. And so this will be for a very broad like demographic subset of the community. One of the very longer-term studies out there. And so trying and specifically geared towards isolating the longer-term effect. And so the coolest thing for me would be, are there long-term bets that people make? Otherwise, I think you can sort of start to add a picture of the cash transfer, they'll spend it in this way and things like that. But specifically that sort of long-term investment piece. And then I think a little bit how that's interacting with how I think the sort of gender and household planning stuff is really interesting. That
everyone has sort of individual safety net, they're not dependent on other people. Everyone is also feeling less stressed. The household itself has like a lot of leeway to sort of plan how they're going to live their lives and aren't worried next month about how does that change how that feels. Those feel like the things that are especially unique to UDI versus the overall sort of evidence for cash. So that's what I'm watching.
The question about if people make these long-term investments probably depends somewhat on whether they actually believe they're going to get their money like 11 years from now.
Yeah.
So to what extent like do you expect people to believe that? Is that something to measure?
Right, it's a good question. It's one that argues in favor of sort of doing that first follow-up survey after 2-year point. And so this is, the first sort of comparison point we'll have is people who've been receiving cash for 2 years. Some people have that cash ending at that point. Some people have that cash sort of continuing on. And so I think we sort of try to engineer it so there's a lot of time to learn about GiveDirectly. We're also choosing a site where it's sort of surrounded by areas where we worked before. And so banking a little bit off the reputational incentives. Because I think, introducing yourself to a community takes a while. I think the other thing you try to do, which we'll have to figure out, is sort of like specific tactics to try to get, anchor in people's minds. You have X months left. And so I think that looks like, as a reminder, you're going to continue to receive payments until 2030 or something like that. Every time you do the follow-up call or something like that. Because it's a pretty important question. So you try to engineer it in different ways.
I think I have time for 2 more questions. Joe, how are you guys picking the villages, and are any getting excluded? And also, are you working with any other NGOs to measure effects long term with you guys, like health impacts or HIV rates or anything like that?
Yeah. And so we'll pick the villages to sort of meet a set of operational criteria. And so mostly that's rural, but still sufficiently dense that you can find people walking house to house. And so that looks like a lot of Kenyan, sort of like modal Kenyan person lives in that type of village. So that's how we pick. And so that produces a set of sort of like potentially eligible villages. And then you randomly assign them to the different possible groups. People receiving the pure long-term basic income, people receiving the lump sum, people not receiving the craft. The sort of main NGO we'll work with a surveying contractor like Innovations for Poverty Action, which basically does this type of research surveying as their job. And so we'll use a specific contractor like that to make sure that the surveying is independent. People tell you different answers that GiveDirectly goes back and says that you spend it well, versus somebody who's sort of totally independently engaging with the community. So that's the main one we'll use. I don't know if we'll sort of want to pick up extras, health specific ones.
Is everybody else interested in it? Because I know so much other money goes there. There's so many other NGOs. Do you guys get any like thumbs up or thumbs down from other NGOs?
I feel like my conversations with the other NGOs, it's sort of been like trading tactics of like this region is like this versus other people who are specifically interested in studying our result. It's a good question. Like I know you like the work you're doing there. And so if you have someone who would be interested in that would be cool. At the very least, like how a survey and contractors would track the sort of important process themselves.
In terms of getting more data, has anybody thought about like working somehow across the organization side, getting actual transactional data from processors, or somehow applying algorithms that you like category data just to like study how currency actually moves through humans. It'd be interesting to how itself prove the effects, positive effects.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool question. I know some studies have, the way you get out with sort of mobile money provider is like having sign up in your name serve and you get the full statement. And so I know some studies have done it. I'm not sure, like, I'm thinking of is mostly a loans one, so I'm not sure if cash loans done that. There's a trade-off with making sure people believe that, yeah, we'll see your transactions, but it's still unconditional, which is a little bit tricky.
I mean, if you could somehow, like, maybe another researcher never get to individual transactions. It's data set. It's
there's been some research on M-Pesa and like how it impacted and things like that. M-Pesa is a mobile money provider. I haven't been as much into that, but yeah, I know there's been some research there. The other thing for us is people, though it is mobile money and though it can be sort of phone to phone, the thing we found is people typically withdraw once they receive it, and so then it goes out of the network.
The initial transactions, if you have good payment processing in place. It'd be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, that's a cool question.
All right, well, I think we're just about out of time, but I want to first give a big hand to Joe for being here. Final thing I want to mention, so Joe introduced us, said we're universal income projects, so we've been working in the Bay Area over the last year or so to host events talking about the idea of universal basic income from a bunch of different viewpoints. We're also bringing advocates together to work to raise the conversation around the United States. So if that's something that you're interested in getting involved with, come talk to us. You can find us on Facebook at Universal Income Project. And one last thing, tomorrow, we're actually doing an event with the Wikipedia Foundation. Where is John? Yeah, if you wanted to say a couple words about that.
Sure. So basically, it's a project I've been thinking about for a few months. Most people learn about basic income for the first time by searching for it on Google and then going to Wikipedia, because that's how people learn about things nowadays. The Wikipedia article for basic income is kind of a mess. There's a lot of neutrality issues. It's like rambling. It's referencing a lot of stuff that is dated. It's not referencing current things, just stylistic issues. So I thought it would be a cool thing to get together and work on just improving that article. After we posted about it, some folks from the Wikimedia Foundation reached out and said, we also wanted to hold an event that month. We don't really have a theme yet, but we're into the idea of basic income. Do you want to merge those two things? So we're going to do that at the Noisebridge Hackerspace starting at 6:30 p.m. tomorrow. That's at 2169 Mission. And I'll be getting there early, and we'll have snacks and drinks and stuff, and we'll have a setup and internet and all tables and chairs and all the things we need. So if you want to come out to that, it's on the meetup, I think.
Yeah, it's also on